All right, and I'm going to start with just what AppSciComm is. The Appalachian Science Communicators is a dynamic group of science communicators in the Appalachian region. We were founded in early 2019, and we seek to provide science communication support and camaraderie in a traditionally underserved part of the country. We welcome science communicators of every ilk, practicing journalists, institutional writers, freelancers, talkative scientists, students, podcasters, and everyone in between. So we're for everyone. Appalachia, when we refer to that, we're very inclusive. We're taking every single state that touches on the Appalachian mountain range. Essentially, it's a region in the eastern United States, and it extends from New York to Mississippi. If you have friends or others that you think might be interested in joining, please send them our way. We have a mailing list. Becoming a member is very easy. You just sign up for our mailing list. And if you are so inclined, please pay us $10 because this is an all volunteer run organization and we do have some expenses to keep it going. And with that, I am very happy to introduce today's speaker, Tom Hansell. Hi, Tom. And to introduce him, he's a filmmaker, author, and educator whose work focuses on rural communities in Southern Appalachia. His documentary work has been screened at the Museum of Modern Art and has been included in the Southern Circuit Tour of Independent Filmmakers. He began his career at the Appalshop Media Arts Center, and he currently teaches at Appalachian State University. Welcome, Tom. Before he gets started on a presentation that he has to offer us, I want to first run a quick trailer for his film, After Coal, which he'll be spending time talking about because I think it really, we have a lot we can learn from it in the ways of communicating with a community in Appalachia and telling their stories. So I am going to share my screen. Oh, let me stop. I need to remember to click the audio. You're going to want the audio. Hang on just a second here. Share sound, share screen. All right. Can somebody give me a thumbs up? Are you seeing? Great. All right. With that.
I'm looking for the stone hewed out of the mountain. I'm looking for the stone come rolling down from Babylon. I'm looking for the stone hewed out of the mountain, tearing down the kingdom of this world. The future of coal, they laid off a whole lot of coal miners now. So I don't really know how it's going to run.
When I got out of high school, and you can ask anybody that knows me, I said, I am not coming back to Harlan County ever.
It looks to me as if the history of the coal industry in Kentucky has followed the same lines as the coal industry in Wales. There were almost 250,000 miners working in South Wales alone. Now, as we are talking now, we've got about, maybe about 600.
If the going gets tough, we all get together. And I think it was proved during the miners' strike not to forget our roots, our mining, where we've all come from, but build on that.
Maybe this is a world trend that we have used up all our resources in the world, so it's a global problem. It's not just a coalfield problem.
I love watching that. And the documentary is wonderful. The book, wonderful if you get a chance to pick it up. I really especially appreciate the music aspect of it. So I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about that. It really kind of connects you to community. But with that, Tom, please take over.
Great. Well, thank you. And I appreciate all the work Allison and Laura and the rest of the AppSciComm folks have done to bring me here. I will, I guess, maybe start with a disclaimer in that I am not a scientist by any means. As you probably heard from my introduction, I'm both a filmmaker and an educator, and I've written. So I guess I'm a communicator, but the science part, I have a great respect for science, but I can't claim to be an expert on that. So I'm going to talk more about communication, community building, different techniques, and using the After Coal project as a primary example. I've been working in the Appalachian region for longer than I care to admit. At least 30 years, probably 40 at this point. Yeah, 30, 35 maybe. So I do have some experience, but I think just in order to keep things focused, talking about the After Coal project is a good way to do that. And I appreciate this opportunity to do that. Um, so I think what I want to do is first provide just a real quick overview of the project for folks that aren't familiar, and then maybe talk a little more in depth about the process and some of the lessons. And I'm hoping, because for me, it's more interesting when I hear more voices besides myself. I'm hoping we can open this up to an interactive conversation. And if you all have questions, I would also just encourage you, if you want to use the chat to kind of save questions as they come up, that might be a good way to do it. If I'm on a roll, I may not always notice something in the chat, so bear with me. I've done enough Zoom teaching to realize that I'm not that good at following the chat, but we'll make sure we get them before this session is over. All right, so I'm going to share. I've got a few slides prepared for you, and I'm going to see if I'm as good as Allison at sharing the screen. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen and make this into a view the slideshow. Can y'all see the
Perfect.
title screen? Excellent. All right. So I'm just going to move to this slide kind of gives my cue to give an overview of the After Coal project. So as you've kind of picked up, it's a long-term exchange project. It is really designed to highlight inspiring individuals and organizations who are building a new future in the coal fields of Central Appalachia and South Wales. I started on the project around 2010 and wrapped up kind of the most of the project around 2019. But as you can see, I'm still talking about it. There's still pieces of it that are ongoing. So the main elements of the project that I just want to highlight, because I'll refer to them later on as I go through the presentation, is that really the centerpiece is a public television documentary that was screened both on public television in the US as well as at international festivals and conferences and community gatherings. We also did a series of public forums. I'll talk about that later on, both in Appalachia and in South Wales. We also had an exchange of individuals that came back and forth. There was a series of radio reports that came out of it. There was the book that Allison referred to that was published by West Virginia University Press in 2018. And there still is a website. I think that was mentioned on the trailer, but there's still aftercoal.com you can go to, and there's actually some lesson plans that are designed for undergraduate classes or high school classes that are on that. Some educational work that was done with it. So I want to talk a little bit about, I didn't just imagine this project or dream it up out of nowhere. I want to talk a little bit about the history of it. Actually, the next two slides might be repetitive, but I found I've done presented a lot, and people are not always familiar with a lot of the places we're talking about because they are particularly rural places. So this is our roughly hand-drawn map of the Appalachian Mountains. And you can see the shaded in area is the Appalachian coal fields, which include Pittsburgh, where I know Allison and Laura are, and stretch all the way down to Alabama. Most of the Appalachian section of this film was shot in Harlan County, Kentucky, which is right on the Kentucky-Virginia border in the red there. And then in Wales, this is again, not exactly to scale map, but it's enough to give you an idea that Wales is a country to the west of England. It's actually about the size of New Jersey, and the coal fields are in the valleys of South Wales. And in particular, we were focusing on two valleys in the coal fields, the Dulais Valley and the Avon Valley. And you can see they're just above Bristol Bay there, not too far from the cities of Cardiff or Swansea. So that's kind of the where. Now I'm going to go back and talk about the history, because this is, again, I didn't dream this project up out of nowhere. This project was actually built on, I like to say, I'm standing on the shoulder of giants. One of those giants was in 1974, an American graduate student named John Gaventa. He was a graduate student in political science, had gotten a fellowship to study at Oxford, but was also very interested in coal mining issues. And he traveled to Wales, where the miners were on strike in 1974, and started doing a set of interviews. He met Dr. Hal Francis there, who's a historian, whose father was actually the leader of the mine workers in South Wales at the time. And the two of them started gathering a lot of stories, and John Gaventa brought them back to Appalachia and shared them in the class with Dr. Helen Matthews Lewis, who was a sociologist teaching at what at that time was called Clinch Valley College in Wise County, Virginia, just over the mountain from Harlan County, Kentucky. It's now called University of Virginia College at Wise. And Helen Lewis is very influential in the field of Appalachian studies in particular. A lot of times she's referred to as the godmother of Appalachian studies. But she really picked up this idea of an exchange and carried it on. In fact, after she left Clinch Valley College, she was working at the Highlander Center and working with John Gaventa at the Highlander Center. And they envisioned a kind of a working class exchange where coal miners from Wales and Appalachia would come back and forth. And in fact, I have a whole presentation that did happen in 1979. There was a group of Welsh miners that came to Appalachia. In the early 80s, there was some women miners that went over to Wales. But about that time, the coal industry collapsed. There was a nationwide strike in 1984 in Wales, and the coal industry in the UK collapsed. And that part of the exchange kind of died away. But Dr. Pat Beaver, an anthropologist who taught here at Appalachian State University and was director of our Center for Appalachian Studies for a long time, continued to work with Helen Lewis and Hal Francis to do an exchange of scholars, and continued this exchange and had exchanges of students, and actually archived all of those tapes that John Gaventa had started recording here at Appalachian State University. And that's how I sort of discovered this whole rich history. That said, this issue of transition from fossil fuels is something I've been thinking about for a long time. So I'm going to move to the next slide. And if you'll bear with me, this is my preemptive strike. A lot of people ask, well, why did you start this project? And I actually wrote a section of just a page. I'm not going to read the whole book, but a section of the After Coal book about it. And I'm just going to read one page that kind of gives you a sense of the roots, for me, of my involvement in this ongoing exchange and what became the After Coal project. So this section of the book is called The Most Difficult Question. EPA, Expanding Poverty in America. This statement is written in 3-foot-high letters on a banner stretched over a bandstand in a public park in Pikeville, Kentucky. It's June 2012, and I'm just starting production of the After Coal documentary. The crowd around me is dressed in the reflective stripes of mining uniforms or in T-shirts reading Friends of Coal and Walker Heavy Machinery. I'm documenting a coal industry-sponsored pep rally before a public hearing on new water quality regulations proposed for mountaintop removal coal mines. The speaker on stage, actually Kentucky Representative Rocky Adkins, is proudly proclaiming his family's heritage in the coal industry. He concludes his passionate statement with a question: if we can't mine coal, what are we going to do in Eastern Kentucky? Good question. As a filmmaker who spent most of my career living and working in the coal fields of Eastern Kentucky and documenting mining issues, this is an important but difficult question to answer. My earlier documentaries, Coal Bucket Outlaw and The Electricity Ferry, were intended to start civil conversations between workers in the coal industry and other community members about a shared vision for good jobs, clean air, clean water, and a safe working environment. However, the conversation almost always broke down as soon as someone pointed out the obvious. That was that the coal industry had long been the only model of economic development in the Central Appalachian region. More examples of what life after coal might look like were desperately needed to move the conversation ahead. As I struggled with the haunting question, if we can't mine coal, what are we going to do? The image of Welsh mining villages rising from the ashes left by the coal industry captured my imagination. At that point, I naively thought that if I could just learn a few details about how Welsh communities made the transition, then I could identify specific solutions to help coal communities in Appalachia. However, I quickly learned the secret to life after coal was not that simple. The process of creating the After Coal documentary took more than 5 years, and during that time, I learned to stop looking for concrete solutions and start supporting an ongoing conversation about how to create healthy communities. International efforts to address climate change make this challenge especially intense for coal-producing regions. As our economy shifts from fossil fuels, how can we ensure that places where fossil fuels are extracted do not continue to bear an unfair share of the costs of extraction? I believe there's as many solutions for life after coal as there are residents of mining communities. And I hope that these stories from South Wales and Central Appalachia will inspire people to discover solutions that work in their home communities. So that kind of gets to the why in terms of the overview. I want to talk a little bit just about the process of, besides just filming, kind of how we started to engage in communities. And again, I hope we might be able to get a little deeper into this in the Q&A, but this will give us kind of a quick overview. I would say the first thing I want to highlight is that the principles that really guided this project were principles of this idea of a just transition. I think I referenced that in the passage I just read, and I've got a definition from the Climate Justice Alliance up on the screen here that talks about a place-based set of principles, processes, and practices that build economic and political power to shift from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy. And I think place-based is key because it means there's not one template that's going to work everywhere, and that it involves community engagement. And then I do want to highlight this idea that if the process of transition is not just, the outcome will never be, because I really do believe it's hard to separate product from process. And that's something that sometimes is hard to communicate. It's easier to experience, and you kind of learn that through experience. So one of the first things we did with the After Coal project was just simply start talking about similarities and differences between Appalachia and South Wales. And you can see one of the similarities is the landscape. From that slide, geography, there's narrow valleys. The coal fields look pretty similar in places. Wales had less forest than Appalachia, but pretty similar topography. Also tight-knit communities, strong regional identity, and people who are connected both coal and regional heritage and regional folkways with their regional identity. Those were very similar. And in fact, a tradition of singing together in both places really hit the highlights. And we'll talk a little bit more about the music in a minute, but I know Allison mentioned that in the beginning. And at the same time, there were also some serious differences. I put this up just as this is a picture of the Clover Fork of the Cumberland River in Harlan County, Kentucky. And it's just to remind me about talking about the difference between water quality and water protection regulations in both places. But a lot of that is tied to a bigger picture, and that is that in the UK, the whole coal industry was nationalized after World War II. So in 1947, the coal industry was nationalized. That means it was managed by a national coal board. It means that unions were encouraged. And it means that decisions about running the mines were often made not just with the bottom line, the profit in order, but also with community benefits, which include not just employment, but include things like water quality and safety. That's not to say that it's perfect, because it wasn't. There have been horrible mining accidents, slate dumps that have wiped out school children. I can go into the more details than we've got time for today. But it is a slight shift in focus that I think is really important and shows up in the legacy, particularly in water quality, where in Wales there was very strict water quality reclamation. And here in Kentucky, you can kind of see, which actually isn't so So different than any other place in Appalachia. I'm not trying to trash Kentucky, but you can see there's a fair amount of just detritus along the side of the river. And I know from folks that have done water testing that there's also definitely acid runoff and maybe some heavy metal pollution in that part of the Clover Fork of the Cumberland. Another big difference that's because of this legacy of national coal board and national ownership and management of the industry and the private approach in the United States is this issue of land ownership. So this is just a slide from a report from the West Virginia Center on Budget and Policy, Who Owns West Virginia. This came out, I'm trying to remember, early 2000s. I don't remember the exact year. And you can see the darker colors are with where these are counties where greater than 50% of the land is owned by the top 10 landowners, which are all absentee corporations. And you can see that concentration is in the southwestern part of the state, which is really the main part of the coal fields. There are coal fields further north and closer to Pittsburgh, but there's really a big concentration of absentee ownership in the southwest coal fields. And that's different than in Wales. A lot of that coal board land got turned over to forestry, and although it wasn't necessarily quote unquote owned by local people, there was at least a democratic process, a governmental process to make decisions about what was happening with that land. So that was a key difference. I do think kind of underscoring all of this in both places was a really strong civic infrastructure that even without outside resources, even with environmental challenges, even with economic challenges, challenges like land ownership, identity and just a commitment to neighbors held people together. And to me, that was really important because that's where you get the why. People have to care in order to work, find ways to work and reinvent their economy and find ways to be resilient. So most of After Coal is literally just featuring stories of individuals or organizations that are doing that work. I guess I'll touch on a couple of the stories in combination with this idea of community forums that we did. So, and that's the next slide. So I've mentioned that part of the exchange was not just myself going back and forth and trading video clips back and forth, which we did, but it was also doing live face-to-face community forums and exchanges. So this is a forum that was held in the Appalshop Media Arts Center, which is in Whitesburg, Kentucky, next Letcher County, Kentucky, the next county north of Harlan County, where a lot of the filming is going on. And you can see on the stage, we had brief presentations from Howell Francis, the historian I mentioned earlier, his wife, Meyer Francis, that started a group called the Dove Workshop, Device Opportunity for Voluntary Enterprise, which was really a workforce and training program run by women. I'll talk about that more in a second. And then, so those are the two people on the right. The two people on the left include Robin Gabbard, who was working with the East Kentucky Community Foundation, so a local funder, and Evan Smith, who was working with the Appalachian Citizens Law Center that works with a lot of post-coal issues, both labor issues as well as environmental issues. So they had a conversation about strategies to rebuild the community economy. It was well attended. It was broadcast on the radio and recorded for later on. Not too long after that, we went over to Wales and did a similar forum. So this forum is in the Dove Workshop in the Delisle Valley. And Meyer Francis, of the people sitting up on the stage, Meyer Francis is the one on the left, who was one of the founders of Dove Workshop. Her husband, Howell, to the right, Pat Beaver, who was the director for the Center for Appalachian Studies here at Appalachian State University, is sitting there, and I'm presenting. And the Dove Workshop is interesting because it was one of those, we talk about public ownership versus private ownership. Well, the Dove Workshop building was actually owned by the coal board and was actually the offices for a strip mine there at the head of the Delisle Valley. And when that coal was mined out, and after the coal industry collapsed, a group of women came together and said, we want to start a training program. And they said, we want to use this building because it's been abandoned. And they were able to petition the local government to lease the building for the equivalent of $1 a year. I don't know the exact amount, but it was a very small amount, and they had to raise money to pay for renovations of it. But they were literally able to move into an old coal office and create a job training program really focused on bringing women into the workforce. But there's also now a place where people can get their GEDs there. There's actually a place where they can earn an associate's degree there. They also have a childcare facility there because there weren't any other childcare facilities in the valley. And if women are going to enter the workforce, or anyone's going to enter the workforce, childcare is key. And they also started a small cafe and catering business. And it's kind of an interesting mix because the childcare facility and the cafe actually are for-profit enterprises that are able to help subsidize the building costs, the renovation costs, and cover some of the educational programs that they run there. So we talked about that and kind of traded these different models back and forth of what different communities had done in order to spark community conversation. The other thing that we did was created a musical exchange. So this is actually a picture from the Hay Festival in Wales, and the musicians on the left are musicians from Appalachia. That's Trevor McKenzie. He's from Rural Retreat, Virginia. Rebecca Branson Jones from Denton, North Carolina. Myself, and then to the right is Frank Hennessy, who's from Cardiff, Wales, and Yola Jones, who's from somewhere outside of Cardiff nearby. But they were able to actually do a musical collaboration where they took some traditional songs, string music from both traditions, and played them back and forth and presented them at the Hay Festival, which is kind of an ideas festival outside of in Hay on Wye, Wales. So it's right on the Welsh British border. And that was one example. We also brought a Welsh singer-songwriter from Merthyr Tydfil, which is the heart of the coalfields, over to perform at Appalshop Seed Time on the Cumberland Festival in Eastern Kentucky. And actually, they also performed at a screening that I did in Lexington, Kentucky. So we did kind of brought musicians back and forth, and actually did radio programming that we shared back and forth as well to kind of add another level of the exchange. And, music is also a way to communicate and tell stories. So a lot of times people got the background and the history of different songs. In fact, there's a Welsh hymn called Cullen Lawn in Wales that then became what I learned in Appalachia as a song called A Miner's Life, but it's also called Miner's Lifeguard in Wales. And it's also the same tune as to Life's Mountain Railway, which is a kind of a bluegrass tradition. Some of y'all might, if you're familiar with the Nitty Gritty Dirt Bands, Will the Circle Be Unbroken album, it's one of the featured songs on that. But anyway, it's a song that kind of came full circle. The melody was a Welsh hymn. It came to the United States, became a bluegrass song, got adopted by union miners, and then went back to Wales to become a union anthem. So these musicians were able to tell that story and illustrate it through song. Let me see what else I need to hit on here. I would say that the other thing, most of these stories ended up finding their way into the book. The film is much shorter and really only has maybe half a dozen stories plus some music in it. The book has more time to get in depth and probably has a dozen or more stories of individuals or groups working on economic transition. And I would say after the film and the book were complete, I still kind of continued and stayed in touch and tried to broaden that exchange. And this is just a picture of two women. That one was working for the Appalshop in Eastern Kentucky. One was working for a citizens group called Kentuckian for the Commonwealth. That's Elizabeth Sanders and Tanya Turner. And they both came over to the Dove workshop and kind of interviewed the women there about getting advice about how to do this, what they called in Wales, community regeneration, but ways to kind of reinvent an economy and ways to reinvent power structure in a community that involve more people in decision making and hopefully make life a little bit better for more people. And I will say that the exchange after all of this, after I created this slideshow, the exchange actually ended up being continued for a little while through West Virginia Public Broadcasting. There were two reporters there, Roxy Todd and Glennis Board, that I worked with and connected to folks in Wales, and they did a series of reports that were looking at influences, Welsh influences into West Virginia folk life. They were really more focused on folk life and folk culture there. And I will say also students and faculty from Appalachia have continued to go back and forth. More recently, students from Ohio University and Appalachian State University have both kind of gone back and forth to Wales to continue this exchange. So that's pretty much the formal part of the presentation that I have prepared. I am a college professor, so I can talk forever, but I really would like to hear from some other folks. Maybe I'll stop sharing and we can maybe open it up
Yeah.
and hear some other thoughts or questions or things you'd like to
Thank you. And I
know
mean,
about.
I could listen forever. And I would say you don't give yourself enough credit. I would say this is definitely like there's definitely sociological sciences involved here,
That's true.
heavily involved here. So give credit where due. I do have some questions that I thought of ahead of time that I want to ask you, but after listening to your presentation, there's one I definitely want to get in, which is a theme I hadn't thought about before, but is very present, and that is women. Coal mining is traditionally a very male-dominated activity, in the past before it fell apart. But you have really emphasized how women were the ones who helped with this resiliency and this kind of reinvention transformation. I don't have a specific question, but I'm wondering, if you could talk on that a little bit and if that surprised you, if going into the project you thought women would be the key to connecting things or if it was unexpected.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I would say it wasn't that surprising, but that was because Helen Lewis really was a driving force behind this. And a lot of her work had been all the way back to her dissertation in the 1970s was about the role of women and family in coal communities because she had felt like they had been overlooked and that story really hadn't been uplifted. And in particular, Meyer Francis, her story was really about okay, the men don't know what to do. The only model they know that they were plugged into, that they was successful, is gone. And they don't, and from her perspective, I can't say this was a blanket thing, but she was like, most men just don't know, they can't imagine other things. And so it's up to the women to come up with something. And so she said, she was like, actually, we wanted a job training program. And then we realized, oh, if we have a job training program, we actually need to provide childcare. So then we started a childcare program before we started the job training program.
Yeah, these
But
are
that let
such,
us started a job training program.
yeah. These are the
So
things women think of that make things successful, and I really
yeah.
appreciate that. Thank
Yeah,
you.
and I feel like, from my just lived experience in the coal fields, I had helped with a project called Fast Food Women, which was really looking at how many older women were moving into working in fast food in the early 90s in Appalachia. And a lot of it was because of the decline of the coal industry, the increased mechanization, at this point, the expansion of mountaintop removal, which meant less employees, which meant that men who had been the single breadwinner now had to take other jobs where they were earning less money, and women had to make up the difference, and were ending up in the fast food restaurant. So that's a great film by Ann Lewis called Fast Food Women that
That's interesting. I'll
was
check that out.
released. I'm trying to remember 91 or 92. It's an old film, but it's really yeah, it's worth a look. It's half an hour, but that definitely just simply being around those people and watching those stories be told, I think was a big influence on me.
Thank you. I do want to, for the audience members, this is open for your questions too at this point. If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand or even just unmute and start asking it. Or you can put your question in the chat and we'll be happy to ask it for you. While people think about their questions, I also wanted to be sure to pick your brain some more and learn from you on how you. So I know from previous research that I've done that the Appalachian region has some very well earned distrust. And even in recent years with the media, we've seen fly in and out reporting done to try and understand stuff like election results. And it's really left kind of I've seen that it's left a bad taste in folks' mouth about sharing their stories, about being open in public. So I'm wondering how you approached folks in the community and got them to open up so honestly and share stories that are, I mean, be vulnerable and share stories and communicate with each other in true ways. Any approaches that you had?
Yeah, yeah, it's a real challenge. And I mean, I was fortunate in the Kentucky side of things to really be working with people who I had long relationships with for the most part. So some of the stories about the higher ground in Harlan County, the director of that, Robert Gipe, I had worked with. We had worked together at Appalshop for a number of years and stayed friends for a long time. So he was able to then introduce me to other people who I hadn't met. Rutland Melton, the former coal miner you see, probably the first voice you see in the trailer. Carl Shoup I'd known through work with Kentuckians for the Commonwealth. So that part was a little bit easier because I had already had some ins into that community. I was building on existing relationships. I mean, you still have to spend time listening. I would say one thing that people in Harlan County said was a technique that I guess I did on purpose, but I'm not sure, was that they were doing a lot of kind of crafting projects, like making big banners and things like that, and definitely needed extra labor. So while I was filming, I realized, oh, there's people are like struggling because they need an extra hand. And so I would set down the camera whenever I noticed that and be like, do you need an extra hand? Can I come over here? Not in an obnoxious, like I tried to do it when it was really clear what needed to be done, not like train me so I can help you, but working alongside people that way, particularly if you're doing something together, whether it's quilting or in this case, working on a giant banner, painting a wall, whatever it needs to be done. That when you work alongside someone without the camera, that really builds trust. When the time to pick up the camera happens, it becomes much more natural.
Yeah,
So I would
I'd
say
wonder,
that's,
especially with a
yeah.
camera, that can be extra, add an extra layer of intimidation. So that makes a lot of sense. Put the camera down, actually help interact in a real way.
Yeah, and it helps you listen
Yeah.
a little more. And I would also say sharing a little bit of yourself. People always want to know, first, most people want to know, what are you going to do? Who's going to see this? But I think part of what's behind that is like, who are you and why do you care? And so the more you can share that information in advance and be really transparent about, this is who I am, this is why I'm interested. And these are different places where I think or different people I think should hear the story. Doing that, I think, really makes a difference too.
Yeah. I see a question in the comments from Jessica. Thank you, Jessica. And she asks, what has been the most surprising thing you've learned during your work that you want others to learn? And how do you recommend communicating that and everything else?
Okay.
Speak on it as you will.
That's
Thanks,
a good
Jessica.
question. Yeah, there's a lot there. And I will narrow things down to talking about this project as opposed to all of my work. In terms of surprising, I think one thing that actually surprised me that I didn't was not aware of in well, what I was slightly aware of the idea that words have slightly different meanings in British English versus American English. We always joke about, the boot of a car over there is different than what we would call a boot, et cetera, et cetera. But they had used this term community fund a lot. And I'm used to community fund meaning like a community foundation. So it's a philanthropic group that solicits donations from a range of philanthropists and gives usually in a limited geographic area into a local community. But they have an idea of community fund in that it's a way to mitigate some of the downsides of industrial development or large development. So, for example, when there were open cast mines, what they call strip mines over in Wales, the company that was creating that strip mine would also create a community fund where they would be a percentage. It was like a local tax, I guess. A percentage of the profits from that mine would go into the community fund, and then there would be a local board. So the board of directors had to be from that community that was both impacted by the development, but also then made decisions about how to award that community fund in ways to provide opportunities. And some of it was simple as, buying sports gear for the local rugby team. Uh, and some of it was more complicated in terms of, watershed mitigation or putting a new bridge in or things like that. Um, and in particular, I ran into it where there was a wind farm that was being put up on a former mine site in South Wales, and the company was actually a Dutch company, Vattenfall, a big multinational energy company, and that was basically how they turned the community from being against them to get enough support. I mean, the community was still divided. It was a controversial issue, but they were able to establish a community fund that was giving out almost $1 million every year to the community. There was probably half a dozen communities surrounding this wind. It was a giant wind farm, still is a giant wind farm. But they were able to, provide a scholarship fund, provide funds to help build or renovate a recreation center, and do all these kinds of things that there may not have been resources for. And so to me, that was a really interesting thing, that it's a difference of balance of power, right? It was part of the negotiation with local governments in the United States. Most of those negotiations that I'm aware of are about what kind of tax breaks will the local government give a company to come in. More like, no, how are you going to benefit us more broadly, and not just in jobs, but how is it going to benefit the kids in the community or the infrastructure? So that was a big surprise.
I love that. Wow, what a way to flip that on the head. And to Jessica's other part of her question, well, I don't know, you kind of got into this, but how would you communicate that kind of concept? I mean, yeah, the difference between the funds or the taking away from each other. I know you had the exchanges.
Yeah, and there's a very brief, like they were just setting up that Vattenfall Community Fund when I was filming. So I simply have a company spokesperson talking about it, which isn't maybe the best way to do it. I did go a little bit deeper into it in the book, where there's particularly an example of the community fund around the strip mine that the tower mine was operating, where it kind of gets into the nitty-gritty of how that community fund operates. So that's kind of how I went to communicate it. And honestly, I'm kind of thinking out loud here, but in some ways, this idea of like with a film, you always have to ask, what are the pictures and what are the sounds? And unless you have a really good, clear picture of, the new bridge or whatever it is, it's going to be hard to communicate the community fund. But on text, you can say, you can break it down and say the company made this much money, they paid this much into the community fund, this much was then awarded out. You can kind of break it down in a way, much more detailed way that someone can pore over and go back and forth. That's a question that, people always ask when people are pitching films is, well, can this just be an article? And so I always try to have an answer. Part of communicating is you think about what media is the most appropriate. Is it something that can be done on text? Is it something that just a picture does? Does there need to be a combination?
That's a really good point. That's something that yeah, I'm always I mean in PR now, but always communicating with the folks I'm preparing for interviews is, yeah, think of the medium that you're communicating in and what you can share and how you can optimize that medium. So I really like that insight. It looks like we have a question from Margot here. Margot says, Wales moved away from coal. Now in the US, there's a political shift to reinvesting in coal resources. Good question. What kind of impacts do you think this back and forth are having on US coal mining communities?
Yeah, that is a good question. And certainly it's one I've been thinking about. I'm not sure I have the definitive answer right now. I
I'm not
do
sure
know.
anybody does, so no fault. The unexpected thing that's happening.
I mean, it appears that from the information I've been looking at, which is mostly U.S. Energy Information Agency, and there's an international energy agency as well. It appears, well, internationally, coal use is still growing, but that growth has slowed down, and is most experts are considering it a plateau right now. Still open whether we've reached peak coal. In the US, certainly this political shift to reinvesting in coal resources has slowed the decline of coal. But the charts that I've been looking at, which again, probably back in 2025, so they're not up to the minute, but they're, within a few months, show that it's really just slowed a decline. It hasn't turned the corner to increasing coal. It's just simply made the drop less drastic. And, if I'm actually trying to be sympathetic to that point of view and thinking about coal mining communities, maybe that gives a little more time for some of this economic transition to happen. I do worry, though, because I know resources are finite, and in particular, financial resources and things like government support are finite, that it does seem like it's a better long-term bet for those communities to be investing both their time and whatever money or infrastructure they have into either renewable energy or diversifying the economy beyond fossil fuels and beyond coal in particular, and to supporting, I mean, honestly, I think in many parts of Appalachia, simply supporting clean water is really the foundation of what has to happen to create a healthy economy. It's hard to attract new businesses in, or younger people to live or stay in their place, if you don't have a good water supply. And there's still, in the central Appalachian coal fields anyway, a lot of communities that are struggling to provide good water for their people. So
Tom,
to me, I would rather have the money spent that way. I think you're going to pay. That's the better long-term bet. Yeah, but I could be wrong. I'm certainly no economist. So
Tom, I have a second question. Can you hear me?
yeah, I can hear you. Thanks.
Okay. You mentioned during your slide presentations that there may be some kind of difference between Wales and Appalachia in terms of water quality impacts. What was that in terms of Wales?
Yeah, I would say it's important to understand that. It's important to go back to, I briefly referenced this, but I didn't explain. There was in 1969, there was a disaster called the Aberfan disaster, where a coal waste pile slid into an elementary school in South Wales and killed more than 100 kids and a few adults. As a result, the entire UK, but particularly Wales, where there were these steep valleys, what underwent, the National Coal Board was still in effect at the time, and they just said, okay, we're going to change our mining laws. We're going to regulate these coal mines on the waste piles on steep slopes, and we're going to put money into protecting water, getting the waste away from the water supplies. So they went through decades of regulation and kind of trial and error and water monitoring to ensure, and had a pretty high degree of government regulation to ensure that the water quality stayed good. Now, they do have some geologic advantages just in terms of the minerals that are in near the coal seams that are exposed. That's different in each location. It's even differs throughout Appalachia, but there's a lot of communities well, particularly in southwestern Pennsylvania, close to where I know many of you are, but also throughout Appalachia, where there's just high degrees of acid and heavy metals in the water, that it's harder to keep them out of the water. So there's some geologic differences, but there's also major regulatory differences. The geologic differences we can't really control, but the regulatory differences we can. So
Thank you for that.
I don't know if that may have been too, I didn't mean to go off on a tangent, but that was a big difference, is the regulation.
It's all interrelated and certainly affecting the communities different ways.
Yeah, and it is an example of how science plays a big role. That literally I'm married to a geologist, so this is how I know this stuff. That literally the circumstances that those coal beds were formed, if they were inundated with seawater, they've got more minerals that are causing acid drainage, and that acid means there's more heavy metals that leach out versus if they're coal beds that were inundated with fresh water.
Yeah. Yeah. That is an interesting difference between the two. Yeah, do we have another question?
I do. That's actually kind of somewhat of a nice segue. Because if I am right about this geologically, one of the things that I always thought was cool about Appalachia is that, what was it, a couple 100 million years ago, it was the same mountain range that goes through Wales and the Scottish Highlands. And so I wondered, did you find that the people in these communities like felt a kind of geographic kinship?
To some degree, yeah. I think it varies. There's actually this wonderful recording of Richard Burton, who was a Welsh actor. You probably know him as one of Katharine Hepburn's husbands, but famous Welsh actor from the coal fields of South, from the Avon Valley, actually, where he talks about the Great Atlantic Seam and how a miner in Pennsylvania and a miner in Wales can be underground and know that they're part of the seam. I actually did ask my geologist spouse about this, and she was like, the seam does not run under the Atlantic. It's not exactly like that. But I do think in kind of mythology and identity, and actually, if you just trace immigration, a lot of the early immigrants to the mining industry, particularly in Pennsylvania and northern West Virginia, were coming straight from Wales, often moving into supervisory positions because they had a lot of experience and in a similar seam. So I do think there is something there to it. And people definitely talk about kind of feeling at home in a certain landscape.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and Amy makes a really interesting comment in the chat that folks might want to check out, but about at the University of Tennessee, faculty members involved in a study that will analyze the link between a boom in fossil fuel energy infrastructure development and data center energy demands.
Oh,
And I know we're
interesting.
hearing about that here in Pittsburgh, so that's
Yeah.
good point.
That is, yeah, I'd like to, is that, Amy Beth, is that, do you know who's involved in that research? Is there somebody we could look for articles from?
I'll actually be finishing up an article soon. Our professor is Gabe Schwartzman, and he's working with professors from Emory.
Yeah, I know Gabe, and Gabe actually just did a book with John Gaventa, who helped start this exchange.
Great.
Yeah, but I will look for your article too, because my spouse and I teach a class called Energy Extraction in Appalachia, and we've just been talking about
You teach a class together? Wow.
Yeah, that's a whole nother story. We have another hour to talk about that. But we are looking for resources to teach about data centers. So yes, please keep in touch and feel free to. Oh, I forgot to put my contact information up there. I'll just put it in the chat. But please,
and we'll share it afterwards.
Be in touch with me when that article comes out, because I'd be very interested in reading it and
be happy to. They just got a Sloan Foundation grant for that work.
And I'm hoping to see Gabe at the Appalachian Studies Conference in Huntington, West Virginia next month.
Well, we're just about at time. I think the question I'd like to leave us with, thank you. The email is now in the chat, folks. The question I'd like to leave us with is kind of forward-looking-ish. So when the documentary came out and the book came out, you weren't done. Like what continued to develop in in expected, unexpected ways that you might be able to share with us?
Yeah, I would say the challenge, we always joke with documentaries that documentaries are never finished, they're just abandoned. So the documentary was actually released in 2016. And a lot of times we're using it to try to promote support, particularly federal support in the US for coalfield regeneration, for ways for coalfield communities to reinvent themselves. And we actually did do a screening for the White House Energy Advisor at that point in 2015. It was the Obama White House. And some of those ideas ended up finding their way into the Appalachian Regional Commission's, what did they call it? It's a program that isn't there anymore. It was something like, not GROW, but it was one of those acronyms. So that was what my main focus was. But then West Virginia University Press approached me with a book. So then I wrote the book and reflected a little bit more on those changes, how coal figured into the reflection, the election of Trump in 2016, the vote for Brexit, which happened in England around the same time, um, and and actually ended up as a result going and talking to people in Germany. There's a whole kind of post-industrial studies. There's the National Mining Museum actually runs a PhD program in history and presented there, and actually then met scholars from Japan who were doing post-coal work. So I ended up kind of talking to these people who had studied the rise and fall of the coal industry throughout a lot of the industrialized world. So that was one thing that happened, that I'm still in communication with a lot of people. Of course, it brought me a lot of teaching resources that I use. I've been trying to do my best to share those with community workers, people who are with organizations, whether it's Kentuckians for the Commonwealth or Dove Workshop, or even community repositories, whether it's Appalshop or Swansea University. So we're continuing to talk and trying to bring more people in. It was really nice to get West Virginia Public Radio involved. And that
Yeah,
I sent
I
them
like
some
that that
radio
worked out.
stuff, and they said, "Well, can we do more?" And I was like, "Great, do it."
That's awesome.
So,
Support
so
public
yeah,
radio.
yeah. So I'm hoping that those tendrils will continue to kind of grow, and
Created
the
a whole
seeds
network.
seeds well will continue to grow and maybe flourish in ways that we can't predict.
I love that. I love that. Well, thank you. I mean, this is one of those ways right here, communicating with science communicators who are particularly interested in regional resilience and Appalachia. So thank you very much, Tom. Really
Yes.
appreciate your time. As I'm about to let all of you go, yep, thank you, all the hearts. I did want to really quick let folks know what we've got coming up next week. On Wednesday, we have a special behind the scenes evening tour of the Moonshot Museum that Astrobotic, which is has attempted and hopefully will be successful in the future to get a rover on the moon. And they'll tell us a little bit about, give us a glimpse as to their next rover. So please, if you're Pittsburgh based, check it out on our website, sign up if you're interested. Then for our folks in closer to the Knoxville area, we've got something for you as well. We're going to have a guided walk at I'm told it's IAMS Nature Center in Knoxville at the end of March. And it's going to tell us a bit about carbon capture and explore native carbon capturing Tennessee plants. So that should be a lot of fun in spring, which can't come soon enough. So check that out if you're in that area. And then our speaker series will continue next month with a talk from Amy Clark. And Laura, maybe you could give us a little preview
she
of that.
is a professor of rhetoric and applied linguistics at UVA College of Wise. As referenced earlier in this chat, she's the founding co-director of the Center for Appalachian Studies and is author of the book Talking Appalachian: Voice, Identity, and Community.
Be sure to check that out as well. So thank you all. Thank you, Tom, very much.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah.
And we will share the recording with all of you to pass along to your friends and to everybody who RSVP'd who wasn't able to make it. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone.
All right. Thanks, y'all. Bye.